Live now to Ravi Agrawal, the Editor-in-Chief of Foreign Policy. Welcome to you. Thanks for being with us here on the programme. Now, the spokesman for Ukraine's Foreign Ministry said that statement is, quote, nothing to be proud of. Why do you think that the G20 leaders agreed to more watered-down language on Ukraine this year as opposed to last year's stronger statement, which condemned Russia?
Well, joint statements such as the one we've just seen often reflect the characteristics of the host country. And I think the G20's communique this past weekend, it not only reflects India's stance as being on the fence on the war in Ukraine, but it also mirrors the divisions that exist in the world when it comes to this war. As the G20 expands to include the African Union, which represents 55 countries, these divisions are only going to increase and come out into the open. And that is why groups such as the G7, for example, which mostly has rich industrialized countries, tend to be more cohesive, and they're the ones who've criticized Russia for the war in Ukraine. So that really seems to be where the G20 is headed, towards being more inclusive of countries in the global south, but unable really to criticize things that, for example, the United States has been championing, such as trying to sort of restrict Russia's options around the world. Now, all of that said, the G20 is using its inclusivity for some good. The language in the joint declaration to reform big multilateral banks, for example, things like that, I think, will emerge in the coming days as advances that could be useful for the world.
But what about for the Ukrainians? Is this a blow for the Ukrainian government, would you say?
I think it is, and that it's symbolic. It is symbolic that a group such as the G20 is unable to strongly criticize Russia. Remember, the G20 does include Russia. So just as this group is unable to come out strongly against Russia, so too with the United Nations. And as such, what all of this reflects is a fracturing of multilateralism in the world, a breakdown of the world into blocs that operate sometimes against each other, in competition with each other. This is not ideal, to be clear, but such is the world we are headed towards, where you have countries in the global south that essentially take the stance of saying, well, what about us? What about our wars? What about our conflicts that don't get as much attention? This is not to say that they are right in saying those things. This just reflects the mood in India, in many countries in much of the global south.
Well, in the face of that, we've seen President Biden nurturing his relationship with Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, both at this summit and, of course, recently at a visit to Washington. How do you see that relationship progressing?
This is a relationship that is transactional, that is based on hard-headed realism. The United States needs India. If you were to imagine America's nightmare scenario in terms of geopolitics, it would be that India moves closer to China. So as a result of imagining that nightmare scenario, the United States has to do what it can to bring India on side, which means increased defense ties, increased technology ties, cooperating on the Quad and other such blocs and alliances as the world fractures in the way I was just describing. For India as well, one of its greatest foreign policy challenges today is its unresolved border dispute with China. So, for India as well, if you put on a hard sort of realist hat, it makes a lot more sense to ally more closely with the United States while still continuing to pick and choose various areas where you speak out on issues the United States wants you to. So climate change, for example, India seems to be all in on cooperating with the United States. But when it comes to Russia, as we were just discussing, maybe not. All of that said, this relationship seems to be going from strength to strength in both countries. It is immensely domestically popular to champion the relationship between the world's two biggest democracies.
Mm-hmm. And one other dynamic I do want to briefly touch on. We did see a handshake between President Biden and Saudi Arabia's Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, which, of course, we know he avoided when visiting the kingdom last year. What did you make of that?
I mean, talk about hard-headed realism. This is a relationship, that I think the Biden White House realizes that they have to cultivate in some form, even though President Biden himself has said that he would make Saudi Arabia a global pariah. Far from it. Biden and MBS fist bumped in Riyadh last year, and now it seems to have been upgraded to a handshake. And this is again because Washington needs Riyadh when it comes to helping keep the price of oil low, when it comes to emerging partnerships in the Middle East, Saudis opening up to Israel and other countries in the region, Saudi Arabia's immense sort of pockets and ability to influence infrastructure projects around the world. This handshake today was also in part because of a big infrastructure project, a rail and shipping line going from India through the Middle East that involves Saudi, that is going to be very good for the region, but also, notably, it is something that goes against Chinese efforts at infrastructure in the region. So ultimately, the way to see American foreign policy right now, to put it very simply, is anything that would further U.S. interests against China seems to be the way that Washington is seeing the world and acting out its foreign policy.
Ravi Agrawal, the editor-in-chief of Foreign Policy. Great to talk to you. Thanks so much.